Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to week 213 and video episode number 39 of Music is Not a Genre. Each week I take a release from my collection, an LP, a cassette, eventually CDs. I discuss it, I give you my take on it, I throw in some other interesting things, and I connect it to my own music and to things in other parts of the world. If you like this podcast or my other podcast, Music is Everything, or any of the recorded or live music on this site, or if you like the whole idea that music is not a genre, it's everything, and want to know more about that, please take a moment to subscribe to this page. It would mean a lot to me. Or if you think, if you think someone you know might be interested in any of this, in discussing music in general and connecting music to other kinds of music, the other things that's kind of a broad interest in music, then please share this page with them and let them know what I do, however you may describe that. Quick note before we start today's podcast, my band Rex t-shirts are being designed, and here is a test version of it. A little line here I want to get rid of, but otherwise this is our logo, and this is the shirt in black. So I will have more information on that as this develops. This week is somewhat of a revisiting of a podcast I did a few months ago. It's not exactly the same, but it is related. The topic is musical jokes get serious when a quirky idea becomes the next big thing. A few months ago, I did a podcast on comedy albums, because I'm going through my whole album collection. It doesn't matter, it's up music, but there's, I was able to find a way to connect. Big surprise. And it was like 2 Eddie Murphy albums and the Bob and Doug McKenzie album, so you can kind of guess the era. And what I was saying was something that a lot of people who study or follow or are interested in both music and comedy know, which is that music and comedy are very closely connected in a lot of ways. The timing, phrasing, using conventional forms and ideas to do unconventional things, so many other commonalities can be attributed to both music and comedy, and that's why there are a lot of musicians who very much appreciate comedy and vice versa on even a deeper level. But I think the one that applies most this week is the idea of crossing lines, turning one thing to another, maybe taking something that's considered serious and making it funny, or taking something considered funny and making it serious. Hannah Gadsby is a perfect example of somebody who does this in comedy. But what I'm talking about in music has to do with musicians or producers who come up with ideas that start out as really jokes, as like, oh, this will be funny, let's give this a try. And I'm having a little trouble with my mouse here. And then all of a sudden, other people listen to it and say, no, that's not just funny, that's actually kind of awesome. Let's do that, right? And so this week's, album that I've chosen to kick this idea off with is one that I don't even think you can see. So I'm going to pull it up here. It is there, MU, the best of Jethro Tull. I believe MU stood for Musicians Union, which was a joke because apparently the personnel in Jethro Tull changed a lot in the early years. This is an album that was released in 1976, and it has a lot of their greatest hits from their first several years. And, so I guess the question you may be asking yourself is, how is, Jethro Tull at all related to the idea of music and comedy, right? You wouldn't immediately think of the band Jethro Tull when you think of comedy or comedic music, frankly. You would think of them as a classic band, a classic rock band, a classic prog rock band, a certain type of prog rock that had its own sound, certainly different from other prog rock bands, but, there's no question that it's that. But if you do know anything about Jethro Tull, then you also know that they had a frontman, Ian Anderson, who played what instrument? The flute. Yes. How many rock bands do you know where the lead instrument is a flute, or the frontman, the lead singer, the front person plays the flute? I'm sure there are more, but I can only think of one other right now, and it happens to be Lizzo, who's freaking incredible. She also plays the flute. And having come back after that many decades of kind of being out of the spotlight, that instrument in popular music, again, it was considered, even with Lizzo, as a quirky thing, you know, and she's commented on it. And certainly, you know, Ian Anderson and Jethro Tull commented on it. That, to me, is a perfect example of how something that was considered a novelty or unusual became not just accepted but sort of revered in a lot of ways. And I don't know that the flute thing necessarily, you know, set off a trend. It didn't. But the idea of, I guess, different kinds of instrumentation in in a certain style of music was spurred on by something like that. You know, so right there, they're upending convention. And, you know, if you've ever seen, like, here's a great example. He's on one leg. Can you see this? And I know it's a drawing, but he's on one leg playing the flute, right? And that's a caricature of sorts of what he did, but he also kind of did do that on stage, you know? And the thing is, people looking back at it would say, oh, it's over serious, it's self-indulgent, it's blah, blah, blah. But even he knew at the time that it was kind of quirky and funny, right? And the reason why I know that is because of one of the songs on this album, certainly one of my favorites, and it is number what? I think 3. It's number 3 on side 1. It's the very, very, very much shorter edit of the song "Thick as a Brick." So, if you know "Thick as a Brick," then you know where I'm going, which is, it is a nearly 45-minute song that at the time, LPs ruled the day. It had to be broken up into 2 sides of an album, but it was meant to be one entire song with many movements and variations, and the lyrics were very serious and supposed to be based on an old poem and the whole thing. And the thing is, they weren't based on, the entire thing was you know, lyrically written by Ian Anderson and developed by the band, and it was meant to be a joke. It was meant to be a parody of the concept album, a parody of the self-seriousness of progressive rock. And then something happened, you know. Well, a couple things happened. One was, it was taken seriously. And as a serious piece of work, it still works. And then they did this single edit of, you know, 3-4 minutes. It became a huge hit. It was not necessarily their intention for any of that to happen. They were just having fun. They were just trying out a quirky idea, and it became a big thing. And it prompted other artists like Yes and people like that to embrace kind of that long form composition in popular music and rock music in more serious ways, you know? And so that, to me, is, again, it's like a perfect example of how someone comes up with a funny, quirky idea and turns it into something that, whether it's meant to be taken, you know, it's not meant to be taken seriously, whether people take it seriously or not, eventually it gets woven into the more, you know, conventional idea of music. And I don't even think this is the you know, main example of this, to be honest. This was an album I chose. I've been trying to find a way to talk about that had more to do than just, oh, Jethro Tull was a prog rock band that played flute. And then this popped up. It's not the most quintessential example. There are other examples of this that you probably don't even know, you know, off the top of your head, started out as jokes. There are, you know, let's say this. There are types of singing that people do that started out as, you know, goofs, or meant to be over the top, meant to be kind of crazy, or not conventional, certainly, and funny or quirky. And then once that happened, it changed the flow of music. It changed the flow of musical development, and new, you know, types of music were born from that. New styles and bands started to copy that, but took it seriously and said, no, I'm not just doing this as a joke. I want to sing like this now. You know, people, super high-pitched voices, or, you know, like punk people who were screaming and things like that. Screamo itself from the, you know, 90s and O's and all of that. You know, a novelty thing can kick off an entire new style of music, or entire new way of producing, or entire new way of performing music. On the production side, though, since I mentioned that, that happens a lot too. And I don't know why this keeps popping into my head, but I think of the Neptunes, Pharrell Williams, duo, the production duo that he started in the 90s. And I remember when I first heard some Neptunes productions back then, the thing that struck me was something that then struck me again later when I saw this horror movie maybe 12 years ago, in the mid-O's or so, or a little later than that. And that is, oh my God, that sounds so 80s. And it sounded 80s in almost like we're goofing on this way, right? And at the time, it was very out of place. And at the time, it was not something that was done in a lot of other production houses or by other producers. And then, I mean, if you know anything about the history of how music has developed since then, you know that the 80s sounds are all over the place now. And they're not considered a retro novelty anymore. They're considered part of the fabric of modern popular music. And yet, in some ways, it was them goofing on old sounds or saying, this is going to sound funny or it's going to sound weird or whatever. And, there's a reason why these things happen and a reason why they're essential. It's not just because a musician or producer says, hey, here's a funny idea, it's because people are always looking for something new. And sometimes you have to bust up what exists. Whether it's you as a listener who just needs to listen to something different, or you as an artist who needs to throw in an element that you haven't used before that in your mind might be thought of as, well, that's just not going to fit. Like there's this one, I'm sorry I don't remember her name, but she's doing like kind of modern pop music, electronic, but yet at the same time it's super heavy metal, like super heavy. It's not like fake heavy metal. And she's got both of these elements working together in her music, and I love it, and yet it's something that when you first hear it, you're like, is this supposed to be funny? Like, like does that jibe in a way that makes sense? And then it makes sense. And then all of a sudden it makes sense. And my hope is that things like that thing in particular influences more popular music today. And I know it will, one way or another, because that's what always happens. In fact, some of the biggest, types of music have been invented as riffs on other types of music, on, I dare you to take this seriously type thing, like a middle finger with a smile is how I say it, approach to changing things. And this is, good for the artists, it's good for fans, it's good for the industry in general. Let me read off some of the types of music that I have down here that have started out as just kind of novelty, goofy things. Jazz, rock and roll, punk, hip hop, electronic music. These all started as goofy experiments. One artist might have taken it more seriously than another, but, Kraftwerk has said, yeah, they were doing something serious, but they knew there was some funny stuff in there. Devo, another perfect example, and that's electronic music. People who would rap over top of break beats, they were just doing it to have fun. They were doing it to get a rise out of the crowd initially, and almost as a way of taking the piss out of the conventional music that was there, just cutting it up, Look where that led. Punk was meant to take the steam out of progressive rock and disco and, all the other stuff that was happening at the time that was considered overblown. And punk influenced post-punk. It influenced emo and power pop and all that kind of thing. And other types of music that don't even seem to be related. And the Sex Pistols' first album, so much of that was a joke. And they in many ways intended it to be. They were like, I dare you to take us seriously. And I think this is amazing. I think it's awesome because, first of all, you can have your music that you love forever. That's great. If that's who you are, that's the only thing you listen to, I love you for that. It means you're passionate about something. That's great. But for me and for a lot of other people, music equals change. Music equals growth. Music equals the breadth of life and reality. It's not just one facet. It's not just one type of sonic palette and things like that. And so to have people throw these things in unexpectedly whether they start out as a joke or not, is really kind of the lifeblood of music for me and for people who listen to and create music the way I do. In fact, artists, just single artists, do this all the time. There were things that David Bowie did that were considered outrageous and were laughed at. Prince, certainly. Madonna, even Beyonce, like people like that who are very serious artists and have gone through many changes on purpose, did things that were initially considered kind of weird or quirky or funny. They were dismissed. And then they changed the face of music. So, you can see how essential this is, how vital it is. It's something I've done, continue to do over and over and over in my music. I started out in pop music and like jazz and musical theater, and then I wanted to get into rock, and I took a few years to develop and kind of add that element into it effectively. And then, I had done a lot of electronic with pop, but not in the way that, is considered strict electronic music. I wanted to get into that, so I added that to it. And so the sound of Rec it's why I call it progressive electro power pop, because it is a combination of all those things and more. There really is no boundary other than the way I hear things in my mind. And I give myself the freedom to throw in an element in a song or in an entire album that I haven't used before, that I think might be weird or, off the hook in some way, because that should be every artist's right. And I think it, again, it kind of weaves into the fabric of the rest of the changes in music that come from things like this. And you can hear that very well. In particular, I'm going to give you two songs. If you scroll down, there are two songs underneath the link to the Jethro Tull album, way down, of mine, Standing There and Your Sweetness, that were recorded a year apart. Maybe not even a year apart, but one was in 95, one was in 96. And you will hear a very, very significant stylistic change between those two. And it's because I heard something and had a desire to do something that was different from what I was doing before. Do you remember any musical changes in the music you've heard, small or large? A band that came out, like Nirvana's idea of going soft and loud, that was considered just really unusual, and over the top, that you initially took as a novelty or a joke, which then went on to become like a whole new thing? Or is there an artist you love who made a change, or a producer you love that made a change and added something to their new thing that took their career and other types of music in a whole new trajectory? Do you like Jethro Tull at all? Do you see how Jethro Tull fits into this conversation? Which, by the way, quick shout out to my cousin Jim Castelli for kind of prompting this entire discussion, because we had a little jokey exchange about the live shows that I do on Facebook and elsewhere, and throwing in a prog rock song, and we got onto Thick as a Brick and the whole idea of it being a joke and all of that. And I was like, well, that's perfect. So thank you, Jim, for sparking that. And as for you, I want to hear your opinion. I want to hear your comments. Do you agree with me, disagree with me? Do you love what I just talked about? Do you hate it? Do you feel the same passion that I do for changes in music, or would you prefer the music to kind of just stay the way it is? I want to know all of this, because as always, my objectives here, my main ideas are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you, as always, for listening, for watching, for reading, for clicking, for sharing, for subscribing, and I will see you next week.